consumo de alimentos transgênicos ou geneticamente modificados começou em escala comercial em 1995, ou seja, cerca de quase 8 anos. Nesse ano foram cultivados 1,75 milhões de hectares. Hoje, o cultivo de plantas geneticamente modificadas alcança quase 60 milhões de hectares. Esse crescimento, naturalmente, foi possibilitado por duas razões. Essa tecnologia é uma tecnologia de grande interesse para a agricultura e também não foram constatadas nenhuma ação, nenhuma consequência que pudesse, digamos, justificar o impedimento desse crescimento no mundo. A própria Organização Mundial de Saúde recentemente declarou que os produtos que estão liberados para consumo comercial não apresentam riscos para a alimentação, uma vez que passaram por uma análise adequada prévia à sua liberação. Esse trabalho que vão ver é um trabalho que foi produzido pela Sociedade Americana de Biologistas de Plantas e foi um trabalho extremamente bem desenvolvido pelo professor Robert B. Goldberg, da Universidade da Califórnia, Los Angeles, em que ele conta a história dos alimentos, mas vai até ao final dos nossos dias, quando nós entramos, então, na era da biotecnologia. Vamos ver, então, esse trabalho sobre a história dos alimentos.
In America today, we produce more food than ever before. So you might think that we have less reason to worry about food now than at any time in history. And yet many people in the United States and elsewhere are increasingly concerned about how our food is grown. We worry about whether farmers are using chemicals like insecticides and herbicides. And most recently, people have voiced concern about genetically modified food. Critics have accused scientists who genetically modify plants of playing God and dangerously tampering with the natural order.
We are messing around with nature, and after all, we all depend on the planet and its survival for our survival.
But scientists say genetic engineering represents a huge leap forward in our understanding of the living world, that it will lead to many improvements in agriculture and bring enormous benefits to all of us. And they argue that genetic engineering is only an extension of what man has been doing with crops for the past 10,000 years.
Historians will look back on this as a critical moment in history when we change the human food supply. Using modern methods of agriculture combined with genetic engineering, we'll be able to create plants that are the superfoods of tomorrow.
So who's right? And what do science and history tell us about the food we eat? Welcome to California, where the race is on to look good and live longer. It's extraordinary how ingenious people here are at finding artificial ways of looking naturally healthy and beautiful. As I walk around my hometown of Los Angeles, I'm struck by how many things around us are man-made. Cars, computers, rollerblades, bicycles, and we don't hesitate to put man-made things in our bodies. Fillings in our teeth, pacemakers in our heart, implants to make us look beautiful. But if there's one thing we demand to be just as nature intended, it's our food. Today, we are much more conscious of the need to eat healthily. And for many people, eating healthily means eating naturally. These days, more and more health food shops and restaurants are opening up, offering food which they say is just how nature intended. Among these are Ann Gentry's vegetarian restaurants in LA.
You know, we're blessed. I mean, I'm living in California. This is certainly the mecca of the natural foods movement, organic farming. We're showing people that, hey, you can eat differently, you can eat simply, you can eat this stuff I keep referring to as peasant food. It can taste good, look good, and be good for you.
And you have a sense that people are getting fearful of tampering with their food.
I think people are standing up and going, no, I want to feel at least one thing in my life, that food can be grown really the way God intended it to be grown. Pretty simple, pretty clean, not tampered with.
But how natural is anything that we eat? I happen to share Anne's curiosity about food. Despite having worked in plant genetics for many years, there's still a lot that I don't know. So I've decided to set out on a journey to find out more about the nature of food and where food comes from. And to do this, I want to start at the beginning, with the origins of agriculture itself. I've come to Mexico, where many thousands of years ago, our American hunter-gatherer ancestors first learned how to grow their own food. One of the most important crops that we use today is corn, which we find in everything from fizzy drinks to tortilla chips. And in fact, corn was one of the first crops to be grown in the Americas. But soon I discover a remarkable fact. The corn we know today is very unlike the corn grown by our ancestors, and their corn too was unlike anything to be found in nature. According to agricultural historian Professor Garcia Barcena, the plant from which corn was derived had cobs which were too small to be useful, and therefore had to be modified by the earliest American farmers. Let me make sure I understand what you're saying, that corn wasn't made by nature, it was really made by early man 10,000 years ago.
Sure it is, because the original corn has cobs about 1 inch long at most, and very small seeds, are rows of them. And well, it's not a very attractive plant as a cultivated one. It had to be very highly modified to be useful.
So if corn hasn't always looked like it does today, what did it look like before? And how did these early farmers manage to alter its natural characteristics? To find out more, I decided to visit the International Crop Research Institute just outside Mexico City. Plant scientists Julian Berthaud and Brent Skovman have promised to show me the primitive plant from which our corn is derived. Look, there's the primitive ear of corn. Looks utterly useless.
Yes, this is almost, let's say, it's an ancestor of corn. It's called here in Mexico teosintli.
So this couldn't be eaten as a food at all?
It could have been some time ago, because if you put it on a fire, in a fireplace, it will pop, just like a popcorn.
But it's not very productive, though.
No, especially it's very difficult to harvest it, because we have to pick every seed by hand and one by one.
So the domestication involved going from this small little cob-like structure in which the seeds just fell out to something very large like this.
Exactly.
And even larger like this.
Corn.
So the corn cob that I eat was made by man and not by nature.
Not by nature, just by man.
So how did this happen? In any crop, farmers have always found that there are one or two plants that are different. This is simply because of natural genetic mutation or the accidental crossing of different plant strains. But occasionally, these new plants have traits which are useful, so farmers would come across corn plants, for example, with large cobs, or cobs which didn't drop their seeds, or cobs with fewer toxic compounds used in nature to fight off insects and other pests. Left to nature, many of these novel varieties would simply die out. But farmers have intervened to protect the plants they like and encourage more of them to grow. In this way, by breaking the laws of natural selection, farmers have managed to create new plants to better suit our needs. Look at these pumpkins. Look at the variety in shapes, in colors. All of this is due to natural mutations, just changing the plant. And what man did 10,000 years ago was to be able to use this variety of genetic information to select from the small corn to the larger corn, to select from this small gourd to this huge pumpkin that I can hardly pick up. These things are related to each other. They're identical, but look at the differences in the size, simply due to one or a few genes. And this is really genetics at work, and this is what man has been able to do. Agricultural historians say that even wheat has not always existed, but was rather the result of two strains of wild grass, accidentally crossbreeding, and then being selected by primitive farmers. So this has genes from different species combined into one nucleus, into one plant.
This has genes from different species in one plant.
And those...
And this was accidental by nature, but then it was selected by man, because you had to select for the good characters to domesticate this wheat. And I say man, I should probably say woman, because I'm almost 100% sure that it was the women that domesticated the plant species.
Strange as it may seem, it was this process of primitive genetic modification which has created the fruits and vegetables that we use today.
They didn't have broccoli, they didn't have Brussels sprouts, they really didn't have wheat, they certainly didn't have corn, they didn't have soybean, they didn't have tomatoes. Nearly all of the things that we see in our shops today and we enjoy were not there provided by nature. They've really been developed by genetics and selection, by man, constantly intervening and selecting to serve his purposes.
Humankind has been genetically modifying plants since more than 10,000 years ago. This has been done using primitive ways of genetic modification, and Mexico has contributed in an enormous way to agriculture by creating corn and tomatoes and beans, the modern varieties that we use in agriculture.
But the advent of agriculture meant far more than the development of new types of food.
When man changed from being a hunter-gatherer to adopting agriculture, that meant that they could stay in one place, and that created opportunities for a very new kind of social structure and civilization. And so it has been throughout the ages. There's a very strong thesis that indeed agriculture has been one of the major platforms to allow civilization to develop.
The transition from hunter-gathering to farming involved a whole lot of other stuff. It involved the development of a primitive science and technology, often expressing itself as religion. It involved the development of a complex social organization. It involved the development of architecture. In essence, the development of agriculture was the development of civilization itself. As civilization progressed in the ancient Near East and Europe, so did the technology that was used for farming. From around 4000 BC, the ox-drawn plow cut through European soil, and the invention of the wheel and the water wheel represented big leaps forward in agriculture. In the Americas, the primitive character of farming tools and the absence of farm livestock held back the development of agriculture at least until the 15th century, when the Europeans arrived. Primitive agriculture led to the domestication of many different varieties of animals and plants. In the most civilized parts of the world, other innovations in farming followed, like the development of complex irrigation systems. But by today's standards, the application of science was very rudimentary. However, events occurring in medieval Europe were about to change all of this. As commerce increased in the later Middle Ages, Towns began to expand around the fortifications of medieval Europe. More and more people were leaving the land and turning to trade, but they still needed to eat. And so, in order to produce more food, Europe began to turn away from subsistence peasant farming and towards large-scale farming. And with that change came an increasingly scientific understanding of how plants work. To find out more, I've come to Dover Castle in England to meet food and agriculture professor Ted Collins. Ted, what was happening during this period to towns and cities?
Towns were expanding rapidly during this time, and this meant a large non-agricultural population that had to be fed.
And this couldn't have been done with the peasant farming of the time?
There was one fundamental difference between peasant farming and capitalist farming. Peasant farming, the principal aim and objective was to employ and to sustain a family. With the capitalist farm, it was different. The objective there was to produce surpluses to feed growing cities like Paris and London.
So there were large increases in the yield of the crops that were produced?
Yes, indeed, there were.
In the centuries that followed, there was steady progress in agricultural techniques. Farmers embraced crop rotation, and they developed new machines for planting seeds and threshing, and better ways to plow the land. And these technologies brought much-needed improvements in agricultural productivity. Exciting things were happening in Europe. How were these changes translated into the Americas?
Well, the discovery of the New World, if we can call it that, was obviously going to be a major watershed here. But it's a two-way traffic. The settlers who followed Columbus brought with them lots of European crops, domesticated livestock, and European farming ideas. And coming back the other way, we would have American crops. And the two most important crops were maize and potatoes. And they played a major, major role in feeding the growing millions of Europe, especially in the 18th and early 19th centuries.
But the historical significance of this innovation went far beyond improving agricultural productivity. From the 16th and 17th centuries onwards, people were developing a properly scientific understanding of the world around them. The Age of Enlightenment had arrived.
The Enlightenment was a crucial phase in human development. For the first time, people began to positively embrace science. Even people who weren't scientists began to sort of try new things out on their land or in a particular business, with the belief that if they somehow discovered some new way of doing things, their life would improve for the better.
People began to ask questions about the natural world and about how things grew. People wanted to try to find out, and on the basis of their results, to try and develop sort of improved practices. And the whole aim of this was communication, was experiment, was dissemination of ideas, and in fact just looking at things differently than ever before.
Human beings were no longer regarded as passive subjects who could no longer change circumstances, who were fatalistically at the mercy of natural forces. On the contrary, human beings now were regarded as authors of their own destiny. It was now expected that the future would be very different than the past, because people had the capacity to change their circumstances, transform the way they lived, transform the way they produced, transform their economies, change their culture. And because of that, people began to have a more optimistic view of both change and also of the future.
By the 19th century, important advances were being made in agricultural science, such as the discovery that plants need nutrients and the discovery of genetics by the monk Gregor Mendel. But at the same time, thanks to advances in hygiene and medical science, population levels were rapidly increasing. So much so that by the beginning of the 20th century, a leap forward in agricultural techniques was badly needed. In the past 10,000 years since agriculture began, progress has been impressive but incredibly slow. By the 19th century, despite major scientific advances, farmers still faced huge natural barriers to producing a bountiful and healthy crop. By the early 20th century, breeders had already created the first hybrid livestock, and scientists had learned how to choose and cross strains of wheat and other crops in order to make new improved varieties. Advances in our understanding of genetics was allowing breeders to create hybrid plants which were much more vigorous and higher yielding. Along with increased mechanization, and particularly the introduction of the tractor, food production was on the increase. But farmers still faced huge problems. I've come to Iowa, the land of plenty in the corn-rich Midwest, to meet farmer Max Smith. Max's family has been farming this land for generations. So who better to tell me about the three biggest problems confronting farmers in the past? Weeds, insects, and a chronic shortage of fertilizer.
So what do the weeds do, basically?
Well, there's only so much moisture in the ground, and the corn and the soybeans or any other crop we grow would compete for that moisture, and we don't have enough rainfall to grow a good crop.
So Max, what did farmers do in the 19th century to control this really major problem?
It's kind of hard to imagine, to go back that far, how tough it was to do all that work, but there was no mechanical equipment back then at all. Everything was a handheld hoe and a rake and a scythe, and it was all tough work, back-breaking, and all the women, children, kids, everybody had to be part of that process.
Do you think farming would have been fun in the 19th century? Would you have wanted to do it? Would you have wanted to be a 19th century farmer?
We do a little of that in our sweet corn in our gardens today, and it doesn't take long to remind you why people don't want to do it that way anymore.
Another perennial problem for farmers was fertilizer. Crops need nutrients, and fertilizer is needed to restore nutrients to the soil. But the ratio of animals to land has never given farmers what they need to keep the soil in peak condition.
Would you be able to grow your corn just by throwing manure all over the field?
Well, there's not enough manure. We raise a lot of hogs here in our operation, and we spread our manure out, but it wouldn't cover the acres. There's not enough of it to go around.
And even if farmers manage to beat back the weeds and keep the soil rich in nutrients, they still face the problem of insects.
People were out in the field working from, dawn to dusk, and there were large families, and it was very, very hard work. What would happen if, even if they did all of that work, and the insects came along?
If the insects come along, well, depending on the season, I mean, it would totally ruin the crop. And it was just a disaster, total disaster.
Would it be a disaster for the family?
Oh, total disaster for the family and the people and the communities all in that area. The food would be very unhealthy.
In the first decades of the 20th century, progress in understanding of how chemicals worked was allowing scientists to develop solutions to these problems. Techniques for artificially creating nitrogen fertilizer allowed farmers to produce healthier and higher yielding crops. Scientists also developed chemicals to protect plants from the ravages of insects and other pests, and herbicides to keep crops healthy by eradicating weeds. Together with developments in plant genetics, these technologies have allowed farmers to increase the volume of food production many times over. And without them, even affluent parts of the world would probably have faced chronic food shortages and even famine. But in recent years, the use of technologies like chemical pesticides have met with opposition from many environmentalists and the so-called natural food movement.
Organic food is food that's grown without any pesticides, synthetic chemicals that are put on top of the food, sprayed on the food in the process of growing it.
Do you think there's a perception that industrialized agriculture is inherently unhealthy? Is that part of the opposition?
I think that is definitely a perception. I think most people think about, where is this food coming from? How is it being grown? What is happening? And what is the impact of how I'm eating now going to be for my life, my children, my grandchildren's life in the future that's ahead of us?
But are we right to worry about the health effects of chemicals used in farming? Professor Bruce Ames won the Presidential National Science Medal for his work on cancer-causing chemicals. He points out that plants have their own naturally occurring chemical pesticides, which they use in their efforts to repel predators like insects.
Plants are filled with their own pesticides. Every plant has 100 chemicals it uses to kill off the insects and the predators. All of plant evolution is chemical warfare. You eat your broccoli, you get 100 natural pesticides. You eat your celery, you get a different 100 natural pesticides. I don't think people should worry about pesticides natural or unnatural. If you worry anything, you'd worry about the natural ones, because they're 99.99% of the ones you're getting into you.
Professor Ames also says that the natural chemicals contained in our food and drink are just as likely to cause cancer as synthetic chemicals. And he argues that the vast majority of carcinogens that we digest are natural and are not man-made.
So we've calculated you're eating 10,000 more of nature's pesticides than synthetic pesticide residues. And of course, the hit rate for finding carcinogens is exactly the same. And when you do the numbers, the more carcinogens in 1 cup of coffee than pesticide residues you get in a year.
Paradoxically, according to farmers like Max Smith, food can pose a far greater danger to health when crops are not protected.
So Max, do you see a difference in your soybean crop in the seeds when you use modern agricultural technology as compared to not using it at all?
Today you can tell a lot of difference where we don't use any insecticides. I've got a couple of examples here if I can show you. I've got some beans here if I can get you to hold this can. And if you look at these beans, they're nice and round, very smooth. These beans are really high quality beans right here. If we could go over to another can that I have here, there's a fungi growth.
They're wrinkled in here.
Yes, if we had sprayed these beans at the proper time, these beans would look like the other beans I showed you. A lot of times I like to chew on soybeans. I can tell what the moisture is, but I would never chew on these. That's completely diseased and wouldn't pass inspection for anything.
Advances in our understanding of plant biology have gone hand in hand with the greater mechanization of farming. The use of harvesters and tractors has led to huge improvements in agricultural productivity. Indeed, farmers like Max Smith are now even using satellites, which are accurate to within a few feet, to tell them precisely where to apply fertilizer and pesticides.
With the new satellite technology, well, we can tell where the highs and lows of the yields are.
So you're actually using Sputniks for farming, satellites.
It's really quite amazing how accurate this technology is. The satellites in the sky, we've got ways to coordinate that, and we've learned to apply the nutrient where it needs that and not apply it, not waste it where it doesn't need to be. And that's helped lower our cost. It's good for the soil and it's good for the environment. So it's a win-win situation.
In the 20th century, food production in the United States has tripled, and our lives have been transformed. In 1900, 60% of Americans worked on the farm, and life expectancy was only 45 years. Today, it's around 75, and less than 2% of the population need to work on the land. We now spend only a tiny fraction of our income on food, and we have forgotten what it's like to worry about famine and malnutrition. But what about the third world? I've come to Iowa to attend the World Food Prize, which honors the achievements of scientists who have done most to improve agricultural production in poor countries. The prize was established by Nobel Prize winner Dr. Norman Borlaug, one of the most respected agricultural experts in the world. Dr. Borlaug's great achievement was to develop and transfer modern agricultural techniques to poor countries. This became known as the Green Revolution, and it literally saved millions of lives in regions like India. Dr. Borlaug was working in Mexico when he started to develop new varieties of wheat and other crops which he believed would grow more easily in developing countries. The result was